All right, we're about to get started. If I can invite those continuing with us to please find a seat. And if I can ask my colleagues to please encourage folks to take the conversations outside. Classic Jewish event, lots of kibitzing. Great. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you to those of you that are watching live for bearing with us as we flip the room, quote unquote. This is an issue of rising hate that cuts across different San Francisco communities. And we wanted to make sure that this wasn't just a conversation about anti-Semitism, but we do want anti-Semitism to be in the conversation. So I've invited my friends, Drew Min, Executive Director of SFCAUSE, Supervisor Raphael Mannerman, Assessor-Recorder Joaquín Torres, and Marcella Campbell-White, who is the Executive Director of Lashon, to join us. So I'm going to ask you to each introduce yourselves with the first question, which is, today's all about storytelling. And I'm curious if you can share with us, if you're comfortable, I know this is a vulnerable question, a time, if happened during the pandemic, what that looked like, that you've experienced your own run-ins with racism, hate, or anti-Semitism. I want to know how your experience informs your leadership in this moment, and how we as community leaders can better support one another, understanding that we're all going through this. So with that, I'm going to start with you, Drew. Take it away.
Hi, my name is Drew Min. I serve as the Executive Director for SFCAUSE, formerly known as Papa San Francisco. I served as Youth Commissioner and also as Student Chancellor for the City College. I think, during the pandemic, I was mostly indoors. I don't know about you, most of you, but not so much a story that affects me, but my nephew. My nephew goes to a Montessori school. He's starting kindergarten later this year, but he's half Chinese, he's half Korean, and so going to a Montessori school, he's the only Asian kid in his class out in Chicago. And when the school started back up again, he was among his classmates when they asked him if he was going to spread COVID. And of course, it was a harmless, immature question by his classmates. But, and he started asking questions, Uncle Drew, why are they asking if I would spread COVID? Is it because I'm Chinese? And when I heard that from him, I knew that there was a reason why I'm doing this work, right? And part of it is that it's for my nephew. It's to show him that when things like that happen, we're not just going to stand still. We're not just going to abide by it and take it as we go. We're going to do something about it, and we have to stand up. And so much in Eastern Asian culture, we're told to lay down low and to just work hard. But there's a lesson as to speaking up, and that's a lesson I want to teach my nephew. And so that's a story that I can share.
Hello, you are a hardy bunch. Well, actually, now it's getting sunny, so you're a less hardy bunch. But for a moment there, I was getting ready for the winds. So I'm another of the gay Jews here, and I think about the ways in which homophobia and anti-Semitism have been a part of my life. I definitely would say that homophobia has been, I think, and is a more present and immediate thing, and was for me growing up. However, as I think about anti-Semitism and the sort of particular way and odd ways that it sort of pops up in your life as a Jew, growing up, I really thought that anti-Semitism was something that happened in other countries that wasn't really part of the American experience. My grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. My father was a Holocaust survivor. They had come from Europe. I was well aware of, from their stories what they had experienced, but I couldn't, it just didn't seem, particularly in San Francisco, like, anti-Semitism, what's that? And I remember my first experience of like, oh, it's, you turn over the rock and it's still here, was as I was an intern on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors after my freshman year of high school. And there was some policy debate, and I was and it was about vacancy control at the time. And I was responsible for sending people who came into the board chambers to go sit on one side or the other, depending on their position on vacancy control. And so, I'd ask and send people wherever. All right, so an older woman came in, and I greeted her and asked her whether she was part of the pro or anti-vacancy contingent, and she went off on the blood-sucking Jews. And there I was as a 14-year-old, sort of stunned by that. And again, it's anti-Semitism in San Francisco particularly is sort of an odd thing, because it's not part of the architecture. You don't feel it all the time, but then periodically something happens, Chabad, Manny's, and you're like, what? So I think that's sort of, and I do think that Senator Wiener's, I think as Jews we also have this kind of like, knowledge of history and knowledge that even in those moments when things feel okay, is it really okay? And when we sort of brush up against these hints that, oh, things are not okay, it's a reminder, and it's also sort of a call.
And I came into this role as the first Black Jew who had ever stepped into it in January of this year. And at the time, one of the many new Zoom friends I made suggested in a place of worship. When I used to take my children to the JCC for swim lessons, a guard stopped every car to check the trunk of our car for explosives. I am hyper-vigilant as a woman in the world, as a Black woman in the world. But I think it was the first time I really connected with the fact that even beyond individual instances of anti-Semitism, I was walking around with that same hypervigilance as a Jewish person in the world. And that we have to remember that while it's important for our community to react to explicit incidences of anti-Semitism, our community also has to recognize that hypervigilance that we feel as we want to feel safe, as we want to keep our families safe. And so that was, under the pandemic, probably my moment.
Thank you for each being vulnerable. These are all massive problems that are hard to digest, and storytelling is something so powerful. I learned it from working in the LGBT community with the It Gets Better project, what storytelling is all about. And it's something that we in the Jewish community and other communities really need to look at, because stories resonate with people. So if you're just joining in, please go to hereiamstories.com and tell your story. Marcella, we're going to stick with you. Each of our communities is feeling this sense of isolation. In meeting with other communities, including many of you, the stories are the same. So how is it that we're here together, but each of our communities are still feeling isolated? And what can each of us do, either as nonprofit executives or elected leaders? What kinds of things can we be doing to bring communities together, to recognize that we're all feeling the same way in this difficult period that we're living in?
Well, storytelling is actually an important part of what we do as an organization. Creating a platform for Jews of color, Sephardic Jews, Mizrahi Jews, to be able to have a voice when often they don't have a voice within the Jewish community and within the world. And we really found over the past several months that making space for people in our community to tell their stories and to be heard was essential. In particular, our AAPI Jews within our community really needed the space to be able to talk about what was happening to them when there were incidents of rising violence. And the fact that, again, they were at this intersection of multiple identities who felt unsafe and felt under attack. I think it's really important to make space to be able to tell these stories, and it's really important for our communities to sometimes step back and allow the people who need to tell these stories to take the floor and to express themselves.
I think the space component is so important. Accepting the invitation to be part of a conversation like today, or in Chinatown, like I did with Apapa in communities, for us to come together as diverse communities of color to stand in solidarity, accepting those invitations to be present. And I remember seeing something so beautiful that was a metaphor for the action and care that we need during these times to take care of each other. The members of the Transgender Cultural District invited us for a tour in the Tenderloin. And the level of care, like today, that each of the leaders of the district took with each other, checking in with each other, holding each other's hands across the street, closing space with each other, but also fearlessly engaging in their neighborhood, in their district, standing proud, and knowing that with that vigilance, a change could happen energetically that would be received. And I think that psychological, spiritual component, energetic component is important as well as we tell these stories, as we protect each other, as we come together.
I think, thinking about the isolation of that so many people have been feeling over the last year, and it has particularly impacted, I think, elderly folks for many reasons. Folks may be separated from their families. Spouses may, partners and spouses may have died. And I think, in fact, one of the things that is so, I think, troubling to so many of us about particularly the horrific examples of anti-AAPI hate that we've been seeing is that they're targeting old people. And so in the the LGBT community, as I'm the gay supervisor, so I have particular kind of responsibility for aging LGBT seniors. It is, the last year and a half has been very, very rough. There have been efforts to sort of reach folks. I think there were, particularly in the early days of the pandemic, not just in the LGBT community, various nonprofits and other folks who were trying to figure out how do we make sure we're reaching these potentially very isolated seniors in their own homes. And I think we have seen some, there were tremendous innovative efforts during that time. I think about Open House, which is an LGBT senior organization, and they organized, these outdoor drag performances that people in their development at 55 Laguna could sort of stay in their own apartments and be safe, but sort of look out and see the drag show below. And I think this year in our city budget, we've tried to find, not just for LGBT seniors, but particularly for LGBT seniors and for folks, aging survivors with HIV, ways to sort of reach folks, focus on their mental health, and focus on bringing people into community. And I think that is, coming out of the pandemic, an ongoing challenge.
Want to? Either one. I'll take both of them. Yeah. I think the storytelling part was a very good aspect of how communities can work together with each other. My organization, SFCAUSE, one of the reasons why we changed our name recently to SFCAUSE, which stands for the San Francisco Community Alliance, is because we want to grow above and beyond from just API advocacy to advocacy of all ethnicities, and to combat all sorts of problems. And so, one of the things that we've been doing is we've been passing out yellow whistles, as you can see. Dennis, who's our chair right there, his living room looks like a storage room right now because of all the boxes. But, Supervisor, you mentioned Open House. Open House is actually one of our partners in distributing yellow whistles. And so to to work with each other. The isolation during the pandemic, I think there hasn't just been an isolation as in us being cooped up inside in our homes, but there's always been an isolation between different communities of not working with each other. We've always worked amongst ourselves. And I think this event here, what we have right now, and I said this during a meeting with the JCRC, you might remember, is that this is a prime example of what we should be doing. We should be actively seeking out other communities and building a continuous relationship, not just coming up here talking for a couple minutes and going home and feel like you did what you had to do for the day or the month, but actually participating and trying to work together in different projects to build concrete solutions for the issues that are plaguing the community. And this is why we're here, right? And this is why SFCAUSE and the JCRC, we're so happy to have such a good relationship, a working relationship with you guys. And that just needs to continue everywhere in the city, especially in this city.
Careful, Joe, I might have to start bringing you on donor meetings soon. Beautifully said and articulated. We're going to open it up. I think we have, Karen, what's our time? Good? 15, okay. So I'm going to ask everybody one last question. We'll end on a high note, and then we might have time for a question or two. So it's unfortunate that we're focused on hate and discrimination, but there have been positive unintended consequences of this pandemic. I'm sure my staff, shout out to the JCRC team, they worked so hard on this event. Thank you so much. They're thrilled that we can, they're probably thrilled they don't have to go back 5 days a week to the office, right? That's a positive intended outcome. But what kinds of things related to this conversation can we think about in terms of positive outcomes or things that give you hope about furthering the conversation? What kind of good can come out of this difficult period for all of us? And since it's a big question, whoever wants to jump in is welcome to go first.
Thank you, Supervisor. I think it's the acceleration of the work that's already started in a place like San Francisco. The awareness of each other as distinct communities who can come together with best practices on how to support each other in something as important, as straightforward as the budget. When coalitions of community members are advocating in solidarity and in unity with each other first, and then sharing those practices with others, we've seen that when it came to testing, to food security, to vaccinations, whether we were talking about the southeast part of the city, or in Chinatown, or in the Mission, the Excelsior, the Lakeview, the OMI, making sure that we were taking care of each other during that time, and collectively doing that outreach. That's an extremely powerful message for people to send. And I think that the messaging that people didn't become cynical about of wearing a mask as a sign of respect, or I wear this to take care of you and you wear this to take care of me, that level of care and respect for each other, I think, is something that's been built throughout this pandemic. I think the sensitivity levels of these stories that might seem so insignificant to others in a different period are certainly on everyone's very present mind consciously today in a way that they were not before in the same way. I'm very proud to feel, arrogantly maybe, that that's coming from San Francisco. Is it a coincidence that racial equity was one of the 4 major pillars during the transition of this new presidential and vice presidential administration? I think not. I think that comes from our values and our on-the-ground work, and seeing that reflected nationally and internationally from such a local beginning, I think is a very powerful and positive result of what this pandemic has showed us, what we can be when it comes to taking care of ourselves, our families, our seniors, and our communities, and being willing to join hands pretty quickly when the stakes were so high. And continuing that is imperative upon all of us to see that happen.
Floor is open.
I mean, I do think there's a lot about the last year and a half that gives me a lot of hope, and I think it was a dark time in so many ways, and I think personally it was hard for us, and as communities it was hard for us, but I do think San Francisco and the Bay Area, diverse melting pot that we are, with this history of responding to crisis and coming together to do it. I think our response to this pandemic had a lot to do with what we learned from the pandemic of HIV. And I think, we showed, we innovated, we came together, we took care of each other, and I think, we can be a little bit self-congratulatory, actually, and I think it's okay, about how, how San Francisco, the Bay Area, came through the last year and a half. And I think and I also think, even in this horrible time, dark time, which came at the end, at the tail end of the worst presidency of my lifetime, when we had leadership of the country perpetuating lies about lots of communities, turning people against people, undermining, our public life and our private lives, tearing our families apart, tearing our communities apart. Even as we were fighting a pandemic, somehow some, well of decency and goodness in this country managed.
But, the great thing about what's happened so far is, again, the connectivity between different communities and the people. And many people unite against a common enemy and fear of the enemy, but I feel like a lot of us have united in courage and compassion against that enemy. And that's really what's made this relationship so special, between the relationships we've built among different places and people. And that's what's meant so much to us. It's reminded me, at least, of why it's so important to do the work that I do.
Thanks, Drew, and thanks each of you. May this conversation and this convening be a microcosm of more to come. We need each other, and we're all in this together. And before we sign off for the afternoon, again, to everyone watching and everyone here, please visit hereiamstories.org, where you can learn more about allyship and recording your own story. So with that, I want to give one huge shout out again to my team, my JCRC colleagues who pulled off an enormous feat today. So thank you to each of you. Thank you to Congregation Emanu-El for hosting us, to the Federation for your partnership, to the ADL, to JFCS, and all the incredible organizations that came together today. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here.